Franklin Pierce by Matthew Diokno.
Only this time the dark horse just wasn't up to the job. He was Franklin Pierce.
I received the nomination without expecting it. It was brought about by mutual concession.
Franklin Pierce spent most of his life in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, where he began his career as a young New England lawyer who went on to be elected to Congress. In Washington, he became known less for his politics than for his socializing. He had a magnetic personality and memorable good looks, and as a heavy drinker, he was always ready for a rowdy night on the town.
I have been leading, I need not say, a very agreeable life.
In 1834, after 2 years as a Washington bachelor, Pierce married Jane Means Appleton, an introverted minister's daughter who was intensely shy and often ill.
Jane's health has prevented her from mingling as much in gay society as we might otherwise have done.
Jane hated Washington, hated politics, and hated most of all her husband's drinking. When Pierce refused to change his ways, his sickly wife returned alone to New Hampshire, where she suffered long bouts of depression, made worse by the death of her firstborn child. Fighting liquor and religious doubt, and devastated by the loss of his son, in 1840, Pierce finally renounced alcohol.
It is a body-destroying, heartbreaking, dangerous habit. I will no longer take a drop of any kind of stimulant.
A year and a half later, he quit the Senate and returned to New Hampshire to try to rebuild his family life. There, his second son would also die, leaving behind only the youngest. Over the years, Jane would utterly dedicate her life to Benny, the surviving child.
Domestic affairs. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. The area compromise in Kansas and Nebraska had been largely unsettling when Pierce took office, but there was plenty of settlers, interpreters, and supporters of slavery and free soil poised to move in. The problem lay in the new territory's slavery status. Early legislation, the Missouri Compromise of 1812, banned slavery in regions, but Southerners wanted this overturned. In January 1854, Stephen Douglas, chairing the Senate Committee that oversaw the new states and territories, introduced legislation that established popular sovereignty, that is, letting local white citizens decide slavery issues themselves. Bloodshed in Kansas. The new territory of Kansas quickly became the nation's battleground over slavery. Since the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed popular sovereignty, in this case white male voters decided the issue of slavery in the new territories. Pro-slavery agitators streamed into Kansas, determining the influence of any election. Abolitionists quickly tried to do the same. Pro-slavery leaders then demanded that Pierce fire Reeder. Pierce considered his presidency a work in progress and desperately wanted a second term to make amends for the early shortcomings. His party, however, would have none of it. His poor handling of domestic and foreign affairs did little to secure support in the Democratic Party. Consequently, his party abandoned him and presidential candidate in 1856 and chose James Buchanan. Foreign affairs. Attempt to acquire Cuba, for less successful, was Pierce's pet cause, the annexation of Cuba. For years, Southerners had convicted the great island as a place to expand their slavery-driven agricultural economy. Failed filibuster expeditions during the Taylor and Fillmore presidentials were evidence of the South's attempt to obtain the slave-holding Caribbean possession of Spain. Southerners' interests in Cuba were understandable. After all, that national allowed slavery and was developing a plantation form of agriculture, and would continue to do so until two decades after the Civil War. British, Central America, and Asian Pacific. While a tariff agreement with Great Britain was reached, Pierce expelled the British ambassador to the U.S. for his recruitment of former British immigrants as soldiers to fight in the Crimean War against Russia. Additionally, the president opposed British settlement in Central America, and he supported American military action to keep that imperialist nation out of the region considered by Americans to be under their control. In 1856, Pierce recognized a dictatorship in New Korea established by William Walker, an American freebooter who had conquered that nation and had begun to introduce slavery. Walker hoped to gain Nigeria's entry into the Union as a slave state. Walker's control soon angered the railroad titan Corliss Vanderbilt, who intended to build rail lines and a canal in the National. Vanderbilt pressured Pierce to use the U.S. Navy forced Walker to surrender the country. Walker then took his forces to Underhouse, where the British Navy captured him. He was executed by a 100 firing squad. Thank you for watching. This has been Life of Franklin Pierce.